Chapter 16. The Father and the Fighter. Every fortnight, the most popular pastime of Morniport took place in a storehouse on the docks. Longshoremen, sailors, and merchants pitched in together to arrange benches, scatter sand on the floor, and erect ropes around a fighting ring. Fighters came from all over the island. Some were slaves brought by their masters. Others were freemen but were poor and hoped to change that through winning a big purse. The caliber of competitors varied, but Nicholas had been right. Vondales quickly made a name for himself, beating even the most seasoned fighters. What he lacked in training he compensated for with ferocity, and it was clear to Sade that his brother took a special joy in the violence of the ring. He was lightning quick, clear-eyed, and decisive against his opponents. The money mattered little to him. It was the release of violence and the thrill of survival that left his bloody mouth smiling at the end of each bout. The money did matter to the men who bet on him, and he soon made them so rich that they would salute him, 2 fingers raised like a V, whenever he entered the ring. Over time, he only grew stronger. Money paid for coaches and mentors. He was a young man coming into his physical prime, and many a former fighter or retired mercenary was eager to work with him. Sade grew his skills as well. With the one book of spells returned to them by Timos, he practiced his art daily, focusing on practical spells of weather, working such as calling the wind, clearing mist, and parting rain clouds. He practiced more dangerous spells as well, those that were said to be beyond weatherworkers' abilities. With great concentration, he could move an object, a ring or key, across a table, even if he lacked the precision to summon them to the palm of his hand. He could make a candle wick smolder and could even focus on a spot on his own hand and make it burn, as if it were beneath a magnifying glass on a sunny day. He still lacked the ability to call forth a flame outright. Those secrets were in the books Timos had destroyed, but it was no use to dwell on it. Sade told himself he could already do far more than even an average weatherworker. Better simply to move forward and continue with what he did know. Nicholas was pleased with them and they enjoyed his favor. After many wins, Vondales had filled their coffers, making the guild richer than it had ever been. They trained new fighters and even recruited from the ranks of unemployed ex-soldiers who congregated around gambling halls and drinking taverns. With money came power and more choices. Talk of buying a shop that would serve as a cover for an above-ground lair came up frequently among Nicholas and his lieutenants. They even considered buying a skiff in order to smuggle goods into the city for sale on the black market. Some nights, Sade would not even sleep, drunk with excitement of how far they had come and their potential to do so much more. But it all came crashing down in a single incident, with one reckless death. The man fated to die was a slave owner. He was a large, powerfully built man, once a fighter himself, but time had shifted the thickness of his shoulders to his belly. His slave, however, was a young man in his 20s with flaxen hair, shoulders as wide as an axe handle and legs thick as tree trunks. He bore a striking resemblance to his owner, and Sade commented on as much to Nicholas. "Wouldn't be the first man to bed one of his slave girls and make a slave out of the bastard. Won't be the last either," Nicholas said. By the way the man preened over his slave, showing him off to the bettors and odds makers, Sade sensed that Nicholas was right. The man's pride was more than that of owner. It was that of a father, and here, away from his other slaves, he could show it. Sade felt a twist in his stomach he had not felt before during a match. It was fear. So far, Vondales had beat even larger foes, either with speed, cunning, or pure rage. But the scars on the slave's knuckles and face made it clear he was experienced. Sade settled down on a bench near the back of the hall, one where he could see, but not necessarily be noticed. He had not resorted to using his magic arts to help Vondales in the past, but he was certainly not against it if the need arose tonight. A breeze to whisk dirt into an opponent's eye might be all Vondales required to gain the upper hand. In the end, it was not needed. Vondales was outmatched in size, but he used it to his advantage, moving quickly in and out of the flaxen-haired slave's reach, ducking low to avoid his swings and stubbornly twisting out of his grapples. Vondales played a defensive match, and just when Sade was wondering how he would win a strike or two, he surprised even Sade by suddenly mounting the slave's shoulders and choke him into unconsciousness with his legs. The match was over that abruptly. The storehouse shook with cheers. Vondales had not been favored to win considering the slave's size, and for those who had been faithful to him, he had just won a grand payout. Those supporters lined the edge of the ring, cheering and clapping. Vondales on his bare back, the crowd was full of fingers held up in the shape of a V. But the slave owner, the father, was far less from a gracious loser. Sade caught eye of his burning expression of disappointment and knew something was wrong. The moment the father started across the ring towards Vondales, Sade leapt up off the bench and started to push his way through the celebrating crowd to his brother's side. Perhaps even Vondales had doubted himself, for he was enjoying the celebration more than usual, clasping the hands of his fervent supporters and shouting obscenities at those who had bet against him. His face was red with exertion, his body slick with sweat, and his smile of joy unrestrained. He did not see the slave's father or the bottle in his hand until it was too late. Sade shouted a warning, but it was lost in the noise of the crowd. The bottle broke over Vondales' head. Bright red blood appeared almost immediately, splattering across Vondales' shoulders and dripping down his torso. He staggered, but the fight was not gone from him. The father attacked again, this time swinging the broken shards at Vondales' neck. Vondales dodged just out of reach, shaking his head and blinking to ward off the dizziness from the blow. The room erupted into chaos. There were those who wanted to intervene for either side. Then there were those who simply wanted another fight, this one to the death, and they held back the others. Countless scuffles knocked over benches. Men were flung up against the ropes. Sade saw Nicholas strike another man with a pair of iron knuckles. Carter and Andre were by his side, throwing others out of their path as they tried to make their way to Vondales. Sade stood up on an overturned bench to keep his brother and his attacker in sight. There was no question now. All rules were off. Sade was prepared to use whatever spell or charm he could to aid his brother. But before he could, a spectator tumbled into him. Sade tottered over onto the floor, his concentration broken. All he could do was look through the legs of the gathered mob to see the father collecting himself for another foray. But he was too slow. Vondales had recovered. As if feeding on the violent energy around him, the demonic spirit that Sade had seen that day with Timos returned. Vondales' lip curled, his nostrils flared, and his eyes shone with hate. He flung himself across the ring, leapt into the air over the man's shoulder, and as he dove past, he grabbed hold of the man's head. Then, with the agility of an acrobat, he pivoted in the air, planted his feet against the small of the man's back, and using his whole body for torque, he twisted the man's neck. It was too loud to hear the crack of vertebrae, but it was clear from the way the body dropped that the man was dead. The room came to a standstill. A slave dying in the ring was not uncommon. It was a danger of the sport, but this was no slave. This was an owner, a freeman, not a fighter. And Vondales had just murdered him. Sade knew the silence that followed. It was a silence of fear, the same silence that had followed Timos' beating. It was the silence of a room terrified, a room turning against the very ferocity it had moments before cheered. A room that had called for violence, then recoiled from it when an established order was so blatantly overturned. A freeman killed by a lower-than-low, gutter-snipe fighter. A slave owner murdered by the prize fighter. When the reality of it struck the men gathered in the room, it was suddenly unacceptable, out of bounds. If a fighter can murder one spectator, why not any spectator? Why not them? The thirst for violence remained, but now was directed at reestablishing justice. Vondales would have to pay. Sade scrambled to his feet, raised his arms, and spoke one of the few spells he knew well, calling the wind. A few words of conjuring, a word to bind the spell, and the enchantment came to life between his fingers, growing to a force he held within his palms for as long as he could, before he released it. A gale-force wind blasted through the confines of the storehouse, blowing up dust, shaking beams and rafters, and most importantly, extinguishing every torch, lantern, and candle. The room was plunged into darkness just as the first cries of "Punish him!" were ringing out. From memory, and by groping in the darkness, Sade stumbled forward, making a path to the ring where he had last seen his brother. His eyes began to adjust to the dark, and he was able to make out his brother's shape. Vondales was calling out his name. "I'm here!" Sade cried. They collapsed one another and struggled towards the exit. Vondales throwing, tossing, and beating anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. In the light of the doorway, they saw Nicholas punching a fat merchant in the mouth, his brass knuckles knocking teeth out by the roots. They came to his side and soon had a path to the door. Outside, they paused for breath until they heard the cry, "Kingsmen coming!" Instincts took control as the sound of horse hooves on cobblestone echoed through the buildings. They darted into an alleyway and fled around the corner just as the blue-cloaked lawkeepers descended on the fighting hall. Nicholas led them through a series of narrow passageways until they emerged on an upward side street. They could hear the commotion at the hall. A pair of Kingsmen galloped past and Nicholas seemed to make a calculation in his mind. Sade noticed the guild's boss's eyes narrowing as they did the day they first met. Except this time what Nicholas saw was not potential, but rivals. Sade and Vondales had grown too powerful in the guild, and this was the opportunity to rid himself of them. "They are here!" he cried out to the passing king's men. "The murderer and his accomplice here!" If they heard over the clamor of the hoof's beats, the king's men did not stop. They were unconcerned with the shouts of a teenager. But Vondales was. Somewhere in the fighting, he had picked up a knife, which he now used to slice open Nicholas's neck. Blood poured out on them. They left the guild boss in the street, a slaughtered animal with his life pulling out around him, and used the tunnels to get back to the hideout. It was empty. Most of the children were out begging or thieving. The few girls left were doing laundry in the stream that bisected the room. "What are we doing here?" Vondales asked breathlessly, washing the knife in the stream at their feet. "We need to get my spell book." "Then what?" "I don't know yet." Sade looked around at the room, contemplating the order, the peace present that would soon be gone as the news of Nicholas's death spread. There would be a vacuum at the top. Rivals would fight for positions. Would it make sense, he wondered, for him and his brother to stay, to try to take control of the guild themselves? Carter stumbled in through a tunnel. His clothes were torn, his face scratched from fighting. "Sade, Vondales, where's Nicholas?" Vondales took 2 steps forward and slashed Carter's neck too. The girls across the room shrieked. Carter fell down gurgling. "Would you please think before you kill any more people?" Sade shouted. "Why are you suddenly worried about right and wrong?" "No," Sade said, his temper flaring. "Because it's messy. Haven't you realized people want justice and revenge? They will come looking for us." Vondales sheathed the knife and stepped over Carter's body. "I'm covered in blood. I'm changing my clothes. When I'm through, I hope you have a plan." Sade found his pallet on the floor, unwrapped the spellbook that he kept wrapped in his blankets, changed his own shirt, then shoved a few foodstuffs, water skins, and extra clothes into a satchel. Vondales returned, his bloody clothes replaced. "Well?" "We start again," Sade said. "We start over. Come on to the docks." Chapter 17. Castle Foyle. Deeper in the cavern, Gade discovered a storage chamber piled with spare boards and planks. He carried them up, planning to spend most of the night making repairs to the Elan. Gabriella was already exhausted from the past few days. Since Gade's hammering made it impossible to sleep in the cabins, Gabriella curled up in Nick Ormede's reading chair. She could not bring herself to sleep in his blankets. The blankets were so old and musty anyway. But the successful opening of his chest to retrieve the folio they had copied and replaced it left Gabriella feeling as though they had indeed won the friendship of their ancient host. As she nestled into the high, curved sides of the chair, she could almost feel his protective presence. She pictured herself a baby bird resting in his cupped hands, the journey remaining less daunting. The next morning, the repairs to the Elan were finished. The replacement boards fitted neatly into the hull. Gade and Omanuju explored the lagoon for any signs of the wyvern. When they were satisfied that it was gone, they returned to the ship and pushed off from the mooring post. Gabriella ducked into the cabin as the Elan passed through the waterfall. For an hour or so, she studied the map from the folio and looked for useful clues. But she could decipher nothing. The symbols refused to yield up their meaning. Discouraged, Gabriella went topside and found Gade in high spirits. "You will come to tell your grandchildren about the banquet we will enjoy tonight," he said, leaning back in his chair, his feet resting on the Elan's wheel. "Long have my people been friends with the House of Foyle. When the Kryen hunted us, the Foyles gave us refuge. To show our thanks, after the Skyland Empire had fallen, we presented one of the silver trees from the Blue Woods to them." Gabriella was not sure she followed everything the skipper was saying, but she nodded anyway. Gade was blue, so she surmised that a tree from the Blue Woods would be special to his kind. She spent the rest of the morning scrubbing her trousers and tunic with large soap and hung them up to dry on the bow. Meeting a king and queen was no small thing. She found some twine in the cabinets below and used it to braid her hair up. She could have done with some ribbons and pins, but the twine would do. She liked the effect. It made her look older and more mature, just the impression she hoped to make on royalty. The island came into view mid-afternoon. Gade, who had been humming wistful tunes for most of the day, grew silent. Omanuju joined him on deck, and his expression soon matched Gade's own. Gabriella could not understand their sobriety. Weren't the feast and a royal court awaiting them? She studied the island growing off the bow. The rock of the building merged seamlessly with the stone of the outcropping beneath. But as they neared, the castle with its village clustered next to its protective walls looked abandoned. The flags flying from the tower battlements were tattered or missing. No smoke rose from any chimney, nor did any lookout hail them from the battlements. No one on the deck from the Elan spoke until Gade leapt up and leaned over the wheel, pointing. "There, in that window there, I see someone." Gabriella and Omanuju squinted, shading their eyes, but neither could make out any figure or movement in the castle at all. "It looked like a young girl," Gade said. The fourth side of the castle opened to a lush green slope that ran down to the village. At one time, it must have been a well-manicured lawn, but now it was choked with tall weeds and small trees that had taken root. The Elan flew over the docks. A few ships remained rocking slightly in the water, but most of the piers were empty. Gabriella thought this was a good sign. Raiders would have stolen all the ships, but there were other ill omens. As the Elan came closer, they could see masts rising out of the water where ships had sunk in the harbor. Gade encircled the Elan around the village again for a better look. This time, they could see stagnant water pooled on the decks of the ships still afloat, sitting low in the bay from the weight. Omanuju counted the masts of sunken ships that rose from the harbor. 14, he announced. These ships were not sunk deliberately. It was neglect. This place has been abandoned. Gabriella would have been willing to abandon the place too, if not for the possibility that someone had been left behind. The single girl that Gade insisted he had seen. Gade banked the ship towards the castle. They paused over the perimeter wall and the gatehouse. The curtain wall rose up huge before them, blank windows and more blank windows. Gade pulled the ship hard to port. Along the western wall of the castle, there was a spacious garden, its overgrown greenery spreading from the castle wall down to the cliff's edge. On the ledge stood stone mooring posts for what could only be a dock for airships. Weeds grew in the pathways of the unkempt garden, and its bird baths were filled with green slime. A pelican flapped into the air from his perch on the head of an ivory-covered statue and squawked his displeasure at being disturbed. Otherwise, all was quiet. Gade threw a line overboard and leapt after it, pushing through tall weeds. He pulled the Elan against a post with an ominous thump. With the silent statues and overgrown plants, the garden had a feel of a cemetery. Gade even said as much, looking up at the castle walls and the empty, yawning darkness in the windows. "Never have I been to a place that feels so dead," he said, drawing his sword to slash his way through one of the weed-choked paths. Omanuju threw out the gangway and ran down it. Adamantus followed. Gabriella was rooted in place on the dock, frozen by indecision. Her instincts told her that the island was dangerous, and she was loath to leave the familiar safety of the Elan. But in the end, as her friends disappeared into the garden, she rushed down the gangway after them, reluctant to remain alone in a place that already felt haunted. As the crew from the Elan climbed up the slope, the grass was so high that it had collapsed on itself in pillowy mounds. Tree branches had grown unchecked and interlocked with one another as they fought for space. The air trap beneath was cold. Moisture from a previous day's rain darkened trunks and hung on bushes and fat drops. Vines were everywhere, winding over benches and strangling the castle walls. At the top of the slope, they reached a colonnade and paused through an archway that led into the castle courtyard, which was dominated by an enormous dead tree, its broken and twisted limbs stretching higher than the battlements. Gabriella was sure it had been a magnificent tree when it was alive, a trunk that was as thick as a half-dozen men. The lower branches were bigger than the trunks of lesser trees. From one of them dangled a broken swing on a frayed rope. The courtyard, like the garden, had an air of abandonment despite the signs of the previous residents. A wheelbarrow, empty water jugs, a donkey harness. A rat scurried along a wall past a crushed egg basket. As Gabriella gazed about the courtyard, Gede stared at the tree, his face contorted in pain. It dawned on her slowly what was going on. This was the blue oak, the gift of Gede's people, now dead and withered. She moved alongside him, then touched his shoulder. When her hand did not disappear into him as it had when she had swung a mace at him, she reached out and put her arms around him. Her gesture broke down his resistance. He collapsed to his knees and covered his face in his hands, golden tears slipping between his fingers. "It was one of the last," he wept. Gabriella squeezed his shoulders. She turned to Omanuju for some type of explanation. "The Blue Woods disappeared long ago," he said. "All that remains are trees like this one." Gabriella searched the skeletal branches for any sign of blue, but only saw brown and gray. She was beginning to feel Gede's sense of loss when, in the slanting rays of the setting sun, there was a brilliant flash of royal blue. She inclined her head for a better look, hoping her eyes did not deceive her. The wind rose, and the dry branches clicked as they rubbed together. Dead bark drifted to the ground. But between the shifting branches, she saw two glittering jewels twirling and dancing in the wind. "Gede," she said. "There are still 2, maybe 3 leaves." His face snapped upwards, his eyes bright and intent, even as the tears still wet his cheeks. At first, his expression was skeptical, a furrow running between his brows, but once he saw the leaves, he leapt the wall and scaled the tree faster than a squirrel. Branches cracked and fell beneath him, but his climbing was fluid and unbroken. He looked as comfortable in the tree as the rigging of the Elan. The further destruction of dead branches was of little concern to him, as he snapped them out of his way, forcing Omanuju and Gabriella to dodge the falling debris. Gede defied gravity as he leaned on branches that appeared too insubstantial to support his weight. He plucked the sprig and cradled it against his breast as he swung down from the tree, landing without a sound. Gabriella fished her handkerchief from a pocket and handed it to Gede. He soaked it in a puddle of rainwater and wrapped the precious leaves. He spoke softly over them, an inaudible incantation. Blue leaves on white cloth. It looked as if he held a piece of the sky in his palms. "They are beautiful," Gabriella whispered. "Hope always is." He folded the handkerchief and placed his treasure in his breast pocket. They followed Adamantus as the elk, sniffing the air, moved towards the gate that led into the main keep. Gabriella felt a new courage in her heart. Gede's rescue of the leaves felt like a small victory against the desolation that surrounded them. Perhaps they would find survivors and help free them from the island. If they wanted to be found, she thought. A grand hall waited beneath the keep. Windows stretched from the floor to the ceiling. Scones with etched glass lined the walls, and even the rafters were incised with elaborate carvings. Fluted columns spread their intricate capitals wide to hold up the ceiling, which framed the sky with wide skylights. Stone statues were crowded around a long bouquet table, poised in the everyday task one would expect at a lavish dinner party. The long-rotted remnants of food were scattered about the moldy plates and bowls where rats had fed, leaving bones strewn across the table and on the stone floor at the feet of the diners. The wine had evaporated from the crystal goblets long ago, leaving behind brownish-red watermarks. The figures around the table were hauntingly real, so much so that Gabriella waited for them to abruptly break out of their poses and offer greetings. They were frozen perfectly, too perfectly, in gestures of laughing, speaking, touching, eating. The clothes on their backs, the forks in their hands, the jewelry that adorned them were all carved with detail that was beyond anything she had seen before. Even the skin, eyes, lips, hair looked as if they belonged to real people, just cut in stone. Omanuju finally voiced what Gabriella was struggling to understand. "These are the people of the castle. They have been enchanted." He touched his hand to a servant who had been frozen in the act of placing a tray on the table. Whatever had been on the tray had long ago disintegrated into dust. Somehow, they have been turned to stone and frozen in time. Gabriella could not bring herself to touch anything. One laughing woman reminded Gabriella of her neighbor, Mrs. Zelasi, who shared apple sticks with Gabriella and Dameon every fall. She turned away from the entire scene and crossed her arms to fend off a shiver. "What sorcery is this?" Gede asked. He stopped at the head of the table beside a handsome middle-aged man. A velvet jacket, a fur collar, and a satin tunic, now slightly tattered, hung from his motionless body. The signet ring on his finger was crusted over with salt from the sea air. Beside him was a woman with elaborate hair and a muslin dress. The cloak rested on her shoulders. Gabriella guessed that she was the queen. Like the king and all the others, her body was untouched by the passage of time, only turned to granite. "This is King Robert." Gede studied the man's face. "It has been generations since I have set foot here, but I know the Foyle faces. Some features do not change. The eyes, the mouth, the nose. He looks just the way the grandson or great-grandson of Lawrence Foyle would." Gede turned a remorseful face to Omanuju. "In Lawrence's time, they had enemies capable of doing something like this. But today, such powers have long been lost, or so I thought." "As did I. It is quite disturbing." Omanuju passed close to a man paralyzed in the act of adjusting his monocle. "But these powers are rarely ever lost completely. In dark catacombs, and nocturnal ceremonies, and blood rituals, they are rediscovered and sustained by humans with foul hearts. What we thought was dead was only dormant. What we must try to determine now is just how long ago this took place." "My guess from the decay of the items on the table, 3 years," Gede offered. "They all seem to have been caught unawares." "No," Gabriella interrupted. "Not everyone. Some tried to flee." She pointed to a doorway where 3 servants stood. One was caught, lifting a flagon of wine as if to deflect some oncoming blow. The other 2 had been frozen in the act of running away. Omanuju stepped into the corridor behind the figures. It was dark and unlit, but Gabriella could see the shape of other frozen victims cowering in the darkness. If she had not known better, she would have guessed these were people simply hiding in fear. She remained in the banquet hall, where the sunlight was beginning to disappear. With growing worry, she noticed shadows lengthening within the walls. "This one is pleading for mercy," Gede said from the corridor. Only Gede's eyes, like gold coins, were visible in the dark. "And he is looking down, as if his attacker was small." Then the creature who attacked had the gift of speech. Otherwise, why try to reason with it? Omanuju asked. "So many servants. This must have been a royal banquet of some kind," Gede said. "It was a birthday celebration," Gabriella said. Omanuju and Gede came back into the banquet hall. "Look at those boxes." In the corner, faded and collapsed boxes sat tumbled together in a pile. Balls of wrapping paper open like rotten flowers. "The king or queen's birthday?" Gede ventured. "You would not give the king a dress, though," Gabriella said, lifting a box lid with her toe and revealing a pristine white dress inside. "And if the 2 of you could not tell, this is not a grown-up's dress. It is a girl's, about my age, maybe younger." "I think, if we want more answers, we ought." Omanuju's voice dropped to a whisper. "We are not alone. I heard footsteps." At the same time, Adamantus swung his head up and began to gallop down another dank, closed corridor, a passageway for servants to move about unseen and unheard. They followed the elk, running past doorways with dark pools of shadow. At the end of the dim passage, they pushed aside a moldering tapestry to enter a room with a soaring ceiling and glorious windows. Their light converged on a dais in the center of the room, with 2 thrones carved from bloodwood inlaid with pearls and polished shells. The room was thick with warm, stuffy air, but it was not still, nor silent. A girl darted up the steps to the thrones and threw herself onto the right-hand one, the king's place. Her chest lifted and fell as she struggled to catch her breath. Her dress, once elegant, had a tightly woven lace skirt and a satin bodice. At one time it had been white, but now it was brown and gray with dirt, ragged with frayed hems and gaping holes. It was many sizes too small, a better fit for a young girl about 10 years of age. On this girl, who had the rounded hips and elongated limbs of early adolescence, it bordered on indecent. She had thrown herself down so that she had half sat, half lay across the king's throne. For a moment, she tried to make her face into a mask of royal inscrutability, But as they stepped closer, she cried out in the oceanic tongue, "Stop where you are!" Her voice cracked and echoed in the high chamber. They halted before the mysterious creature, studying her. At a moment she demanded, "Who are you that trespass in my castle and approach me bearing arms?" Omanuju looked to Gede, who put his sword away. "We are friends," Omanuju said, looking at her intently. "I am Omanuju, Aunt of Harkness. This is Gabriella Carlyle, and this is Gede, who comes from a race of people long allied to the House of Foyle. We are journeying east and stopped here to visit friends. We are saddened to find the castle in such a state." The girl sat silent. With one hand, she twirled her knotted hair. With the other, she touched a small scepter resting on the arm of the throne. Omanuju paused. Even Gabriella knew that the rules of etiquette required that the girl make a response. Clearly, this girl was ignorant. "May I ask whom I address?" Omanuju finally asked. "You might," said the girl, who was then silent. The lull did not last long, for she began to giggle and laugh, a deep-throated mocking laugh. Gabriella curled her hands into fists. She knew a bully when she saw one, and Gabriella understood this girl even if her companions did not. Too many children like her had picked on her and Dameon. Yet Omanuju and Gede waited in respectful silence. If Gabriella had had her choice, she would have turned and walked away, leaving the girl on the island alone. After a long indulgent laugh, the girl said, "You may ask, but I don't have to tell." She giggled again at her response, hugging her sides in an ostentatious show of agony. There was something else about her that Gabriella did not like. When the girl spoke, she sounded as if she was making every attempt to sound younger than her age. She lisped, like a pouting child. Gabriella wanted to leave. She had a foreboding sense that nothing good would come of staying and parleying with this girl. Reasoning with her might be impossible. She was crazy mad. Gabriella wondered if Omanuju and Gede had the same reaction as she did. She moved shoulder to shoulder with Omanuju and would have tugged on his arm to encourage him to leave if Gede had not taken a large step forward. His approach put an immediate end to the girl's laughter. Her expression became fierce, and she snatched up the object on the armrest. It was a rod the size and length of a drummer's stick. It was tapered and made of a light blue substance, either wood or light stone. Gede's eyes fixed on it as if it were a dagger pointed at his throat. "Stop it!" The girl screamed and stamped. She pointed the stick directly at Gede. It was no stick, Gabriella realized, but a wand. "Where did you get that?" Gede asked. "I don't have to tell you anything," she said, some of her haughtiness returning. "I am Princess Sybil Foyle, and this castle is mine." Gede remained rooted in place and held his hands out at his side. "What happened to your people, Princess Sybil? What happened to your parents?" "Nothing they did not deserve," the princess said coldly. Gabriella wanted desperately to leave, but Omanuju spoke up. "Princess Sybil, they were all dressed for a festival." "Not a festival, you stupid man. A birthday, my birthday. I told them I did not want a birthday. I told them I did not want to grow up and do stupid grown-up things. They didn't listen. They said everyone grows up. I ignored them, but they forced me into a dress and Father made me come downstairs to the hall. He tried to make me sit beside him and greet all the stupid people. I tossed all their gifts aside. Father became angry. I told him I wished he and Mother were dead. I ran away and went to cry on the battlements. That was when one of the guests found me. I hadn't noticed him downstairs, but there had been too many people for me to notice anyway. He gave me the only good gift of the whole day. He gave me this." Sybil held the wand straight up, then lowered it toward them again. "He was a nice man. He told me that I did not have to grow up. He gave me my gift and told me it was made from the tree outside in the courtyard." Gede mumbled something biting under his tongue. "Do you remember anything particular about this man?" asked Omanuju. Sybil was quiet for a moment before answering. "He spoke with a strong accent. He was hard to understand, but he was the nicest person at that stupid party." "Did he have a name?" "I don't have to tell you." Gabriella guessed that Sybil didn't know. Omanuju tried a different line of questions. "Did the man have any rune markings on his hands, bracelets, or other jewelry, perhaps something around his neck?" "Yes, something around his neck, a ring. It was strange because it was broken. Omanuju dropped his head so that his chin touched his chest. The Sevor's reach has grown wide, he whispered. Gede picked up where Omanuju had left off. The Sevor are evil men, Princess Sybil. The trees of the Blue Forest were never meant to be fashioned into such weapons. A weapon that should never be given to someone without training. Please, release your people from this curse. So they can order me around and tell me to grow up? She swung the wand in Gede's direction like a sword. You are just like them, aren't you? Except that you are blue. A Princess Sybil, Omanuju said. Stop there, or I will kill you, see? It happened quickly. Sybil aimed the wand at Gede, and white light blasted out of its end. Gede leapt out of the way, but it was too late. An aurora engulfed him. For a moment, Gabriella had to shield her eyes. It was as bright as looking into the sun. Then she watched, horrified, as the light took form and rooted around Gede like a whirlpool. A bright light from within him bled outwards and commingled with the whirl of white. The colors spun and even appeared to fight for a few moments. Gede was trapped by them. The swirl rose from the floor. Gabriella saw that Gede's feet were missing. Gede! She cried. The light moved higher. Now his legs were gone. The spinning was increasing in velocity like water down a drain. Gabriella could still see Gede's face, the corners of his mouth bent in resignation and sorrow. His brow furrowed as if he wished to comfort Gabriella. Don't worry about. The light burst outward. A wind swept through the room, shaking dust off the rafters and flapping the faded tapestries. Gabriella stumbled backwards. Gede was gone. No! Gabriella threw herself forward. On the floor where Gede had last stood, the white handkerchief remained, the sprig still inside. Gabriella picked it up and held it to her chest. Tears filled her eyes. She turned to Sybil. The princess was examining the wand with surprise. Apparently, not even she had expected such a display. You miserable brat! Gabriella spat. It was not only Sybil she saw, but every Harkonite child that had ever been cruel to her or her brother. Before she could say anything more, Omanuju stepped in front of her. Sybil aimed the wand again. Now, even Adamantus moved close as if to protect them. You want to be next? Gabriella, Omanuju whispered, think of your family. They will not be served by your death here. Gabriella could not reply. Her voice was choked. Her face was wet with tears of anger. Before she could speak again, she noticed a short man watching them from an adjoining hallway. He was wearing a motley-colored jester costume. The wide vertical stripes were faded. The elbows and knees had been patched. More strangely, he had 2 hand mirrors hanging by leather belts around his neck, one on his chest, the other on his back. The way they swayed assured Gabriella that the gesture was not frozen like the other residents of the castle. When Sybil noticed him, he dropped down to one knee and groveled. "Oh, most radiant Sybil," he said in a hoarse voice. "Please forgive me for leaving my station of the kitchen, but I heard shouts and thought you might be in danger." Although Gabriella could hear the sarcasm in his voice, Sybil remained clueless. "Meshach, take this girl with you. She will be my new slave. As for this man, I will have him entertain me with stories until supper time." "As you wish," Meshach said, rising. Omanuju nudged Gabriella to go. It was useless to resist, she knew. If Omanuju entertained Sybil for a while, perhaps Gabriella could engineer a way to escape. She was not confident that this man would help her, though. He looked at her with suspicious eyes and smelled foul, like rotten eggs and stale urine. "Go prepare dinner, slaves," Sybil said. "You, Manju, or whatever your name is, you sit there and entertain me." Gabriella followed Meshach, but kept looking back over her shoulder at Omanuju. His eyes held no answers. Finally, the gesture took Gabriella by the shoulder and guided her into a corridor. Once out of earshot of Sybil, he mumbled, "Welcome to the prison rock of Foyle Island." Chapter 18. Greatport. This time was different. Between their own money and what they had stolen from the guild before leaving, Sade and Vondales were comfortably well off. No starving, no stealing of boats or stowing away. This time they booked passage on a ship bound for the Isle of Lorne and the city of Greatport, the capital city of the Rawis archipelago. Sade had heard that there was a marketplace for weather mages there. So he spent his days on the ship studying, honing his enchantments, memorizing passages and runes, and practicing his pronunciation. Vondales, on the other hand, was restless. As just passenger and not a member of the crew, there was little for him to do, so he spent most of his hours fidgeting, pacing the deck, or slumped against the gunwale, sleepy from too much grog. So it was with relief that Vondales finally bounded down the gangplank on the docks of Great Point. Sade followed more slowly, taking in the longshoremen rolling barrels, maidens selling limes, and linesmen hawking their wares of rope, lines, and nets. Great Port was truly a capital city, with sprawling plazas, crowded streets, tall buildings with tiled roofs, and a haze from 1,000 smoking chimneys. With a bit of humility mixed with shame, Sade realized just what a backwater they had come from. Even Mornaport had been just a small port village in comparison to Great Port, with its forest of masts lining the harbor as far as the eye could see. Here, we can find opportunity in obscurity. They had lived by their own rules, but the world was still insistent upon a different set. Their list of victims had grown. In his dreams, Sade would sometimes still see their uncle's face, his look of surprise as Vondales sank the axe into his leg, an expression so similar to the desperation of all the others, like Nicholas and Carter, as they faced their mortality, even the girl on Illicane. Sade had done his best to extinguish his conscience, to absolve himself and blame their victims for their fates. For the most part, he had been successful, but he still recognized that others abided by a set of foolish, arbitrary rules, laws that they were too weak or stupid to question. Those laws and their consequences followed them, as unstoppable as the incoming tide. But here, in this city, they could hide, start over, at least pretend to conform long enough to become established again. "A city like this has got to have fighting pits," Vondales said. "Unlikely," Sade said, noticing 2 Kingsmen on patrol. He had seen more on their walk from the ship to the market than he had seen in their whole time at Mornaport. Here, in Great Port, the Kingsmen's cloaks were new and fine, without the frayed edges of their compatriots stationed off on far outer islands. In Great Port, their armor was polished to a shine, their belts and boots oiled, and their horses well-groomed. "Not right here under the king and council's noses, but you are not fighting anymore. You need to avoid notoriety for both of our sakes." Vondales grunted and looked away at a smithy booth full of knives, short swords, and axe heads. "How will we make a living, then?" "Through sorcery," Sade said. "Come, here is a place we're looking for." They had come to the crowded corner of a wide plaza, where men and a few women stood outside an assortment of tents and booths. Some were dressed very much like nobles in finery and jewels. They were powerful weather mages who served royal vessels or merchant ships. Others, in more modest clothes, served less luxurious fishing boats and smuggler craft. All had weathered faces from years in the sun and surf, wind and rain, and all appeared powerful and intimidating to Sade. Young men and a smaller number of girls circulated from one weather worker to the next, their parents or mentors making introductions for them. Sade felt all the smaller, having no such escort. He avoided the richer-looking weather workers. They were surrounded by aspiring apprentices and had their pick of well-trained and well-groomed youngsters. There was no use competing there. Instead, Sade sought out the workers dressed in commoners' clothes closer to their own, anticipating a better fit. He also approached less established weather workers, ones who looked young, whom he thought would be eager for an apprentice. But most of these turned the other way when Sade approached. One outright told him that at 16 he was already too old for such a position. His spirits lifted when another weather worker, a boisterous man with a loud voice and bald head, actually called Sade over to his tent. "Young man, show me your art." Sade conjured a breeze that stirred the man's robes and the dust at their feet. A few bystanders nodded with approval. "Can you endow an object?" "Sir?" "Enchant a sail or a staff. Many captains want to sail without a mage these days, and instead want the magic crafted into a sail or staff. It is a lost art. Few ships remain with such endowments. It is a lost art, but a useful one to resurrect." "I'm sorry, I don't know how," Sage admitted. The man grimaced, but hope still twinkled in his eyes. He reached into his tent and produced a fat candle that was wider than it was tall. It had 3 wicks set into a frozen basin of wax. He set it on the cobblestones at their feet and said, "Light it." "Conjure fire?" "Yes." "But a weather worker does not work the element of fire." "I need more than a mere weather worker." Sade took a deep breath, trying to still his hands. He focused on one of the wicks. Lighting all 3, he knew was beyond him. The runes he had read over and memorized appeared in his mind's eye. He whispered them under his breath, and when that did not work, he said them louder. His fingers grew rigid, then his arms and shoulders. His muscles strained and his joints ached with the will to set the wick alight. He became aware of how hot he was. Perspiration was dripping down his face and even more down his sides and back. The world shrank, just to the candle itself. Anything else was dark in comparison. His teeth were set against one another, his jaw stiff. He looked down a tunnel to the candle and a string of smoke rising from one wick. Then, nothing. All faded to black. Vondales caught him as he fainted. Momentarily blinded, he was extraordinarily aware of the sounds from the crowd around him. "Amateur! Fool! Is he all right?" Vondales lowered himself gently to the ground, where curious onlookers, including the boisterous weather worker, stared down at him. Their faces slowly became distinct again as Sade's vision returned. "Maybe next time," the bald mage said, decidedly less boisterous than before. They wandered the market after that in silence, Sade passing on any more opportunities, Vondales following in a sympathetic silence. Late in the afternoon, with shadows long and food sellers out for the dinner hour, many weather workers departed. All those of higher status were long gone. Those that were left gossiped and traded stories among themselves, displaying little interest in the apprentices that had been left unpicked. "What about him?" Vondales said, pointing to a figure in an aquamarine cloak with yellow trim and a matching vest beneath. The clothes were once fine, but they had seen many days since then. The edges of the man's cloak were repaired, and mismatched thread and the stockings on his feet did not match. His face was soft, without sharp features or a strong jaw. Even his eyes were an indistinct gray. His age was hard to determine. He had just the beginnings of some baldness, and he was still lean, but his skin was weathered and the hair he did have begun to go gray. While they watched, he pulled a flask from his breast pocket and took a quick drink. He became aware of the 2 of them and gestured to Sade. "You are the aspiring apprentice who fainted trying to conjure a flame." Sade's mouth twitched. He sensed their last hopes for finding a master evaporating. "Yes, I am." The mage stood up. Sade detected the slightest sway in his gait. His cheeks were flushed, but his eyes were clear and hard like pebbles. "It was a trick by him. Such a spell is beyond most weather workers. It was cruel on his part to challenge you and foolish of you to try." Sade was in no mood to be lectured and turned to go. The man spoke up. "But you made it smolder, young man, which was actually no small feat." Sade stopped and turned back to face the man, smoothing out his tunic. "Are you in need of an apprentice?" The weather worker answered the question with a question. "Who was your previous master?" Sade decided the truth was best in this case. "I have had none. I am self-taught." "As I thought," the man said. "You are green and raw, but you possess a quality which the others here today do not." "What is that, sir?" "Potential." His name was Gerald Leguyes. He lived in a 2-story cottage that backed onto the harbor. Sade and Vondales were given space in the attic. There wasn't room to stand up straight, but it was warm, and they each had mattresses stuffed with hay. And best of all, they had privacy. They had not had their own room since they had left Illicaine. Gerald had a wife named Jillian and 3 daughters, ages 7, 5, and 2, whom he loved with joyous passion. His returns home were greeted with squeals, embraces, and kisses. And although Jillian and the girls were at first shy around Sade and Vondales, Jillian was soon doting on them like sons, and the girls fighting to take turns climbing on Vondales or to have Sade tell them a story before bedtime. Sade was often the one to tell bedtime stories, because by that late hour after dinner, Gerald was passed out from his own drinking. His flask was ever present at his side, and it was the first thing he reached for in the morning and the last after he kissed Jillian goodnight. Jillian tolerated the drinking. Gerald did not beat her, and he kept the larder full. He was a good husband by many measures. However, Sade soon began to suspect Jillian's kindness towards them was also out of desperation. Having an apprentice gave Gerald respectability and stability that his drinking had robbed from them. And although Gerald and Sade were often away on voyages, she was glad to have Vondales around the house to do chores and simply to guard the house in Gerald's absence. He was absent often. Days added to weeks, and weeks added to months at sea on vessels. Sade learned prodigious amounts. There was no question that Gerald was supremely talented and intelligent. It was these traits that kept him employed. For half the time, he was drunk and could not conjure a breeze, still a wave, or part a rain cloud to save a life, much less his own. But these became opportunities for Sade to practice his own craft. He was often called upon to do works of sea spells that were much beyond him. And in this way he learned, and captains and sailors came to depend on them as a team. More of their weeks were booked than not. More money led to more drink, but Jillian was also responsible and made sure not all the income was wasted. There was enough to send the girls to school, replace Gerald's threadbare cloak, and even buy clothing for Vondales and Sade. For growing as they were, their clothes would often become too small. Yet some nights in the attic, listening to the sounds of his brother sleeping comfortably, Sade would lie awake, wondering when or how all this would end, and what they would do once they were on their own again. For as much as they were treated so, they were not family, and having once lived on the margins, Sade would not shake the habits of distrust formed there. Anxiety kept him from sleep so regularly that at night he took to practicing one spell that still vexed him, conjuring flame. He had excelled due to his own talent and determination with other enchantments. But this spell stubbornly still eluded him. It was a spell for a more powerful mage, who could work enchantments with all the elements, not just wind and water. He had made some progress. He could make a wick smolder every time he tried. He could even blacken a board, burning a small hole in it. The rafter above his bed was pockmarked with such holes. But to give life to a flame, to create a tongue of fire and cast a shadow was still beyond him. Vondales did not care. He was proud of his brother. But Sade was all too aware of the shortcoming, knowing that he would never advance beyond weatherworker to sorcerer if he could not master this simple spell. Gerald said he had the potential to be a sorcerer and even surpassed most weatherworkers. But late at night, Sade doubted this and wondered if it was just drunken drivel on the part of his master. He had seen lesser apprentices light candles with just a flick of their wrist or a snap of their fingers. The only burning Sade felt was his own jealousy. "It is because you fear the flame," Gerald had said once in one of his more sober intervals while they enjoyed a sunset from the stern of a galley shipping whale oil. "I don't fear fire, my lord," Sade said. "You fear what you can't control. I've seen you now work the weather, sluice water from the deck, weave intricate spells with the wind, and even enchant the sails and charm a compass. But the flame eludes you because it has life of its own. You fear what you might do once it is conjured. Shouldn't I? Fire is dangerous." "It is. Don't worry. You will call the fire forth one day when you do not fear it." Sade shifted on his haunches and said nothing, for he felt the cold, heavy truth in his teacher's words. But if there was more wisdom to share, it would not be right then, for the flask came out shortly after, and Gerald tilted his head back to drink. Then came the day when Sade thought it would all come to an end, just as he had anticipated. A knock at the door early in the morning roused the entire house. Vondales scrambled to the window, then shot back to Sade's bedside, shaking him to full alertness. "Kingsmen!" Sade stumbled across the floorboards to peer out and see for himself. A team of half a dozen men on horseback, each with cerulean blue of the royal lawkeepers, waited outside. 2 of them were dismounted and waiting at the front door. Sade backed away from the window, dressed, and together they climbed down the ladder and tiptoed to the top of the stairs, where they listened as Gerald opened the door. They were looking for Sade and Vondales. "Did you know, sir, that your apprentice and his brother might be thieves and murderers? Their description matches that of two brothers wanted for murder in the fighting pits of Morniport." Sade's blood ran cold. Vondales climbed back up to the attic and retrieved the short sword and dagger from beneath his mattress. He unlatched the window on the far side of the room and pushed, opening the way out onto the roof of the neighbor's house. "Wait," Sade whispered. "We won't get far without them noticing us." He leaned farther down the stairs to listen. "But they are not here. They left 2 days ago for Kryen," Gerald said. "Do you know what they wanted to do there?" "My apprentice wanted to make a name for himself in his craft. But if they are the liars and cheats you say they are, I see no reason to believe their story. They could be anywhere. I'm sorry I can't be of more help." Sade and his brother waited in silence as the king's men rode away. After a few terse whispers between husband and wife, Gerald's footsteps sounded on the stairs. Vondales made to hand Sade a knife, but he pushed it away. "Don't be a fool. We'll not slaughter this family too. He just lied to protect us." If he were honest, Sade was overcome with emotions, fear mixed with hope, and perhaps for the first time since their mother had died, he felt love. Love for this man who had taken them in and when their past came back to haunt them, had defended them. Gerald appeared at the bottom of the stairs, Jillian behind him, her eyes red. Sade's master took a sip from his flask. His hands were shaking as he replaced it in his pocket. "You heard?" Gerald asked. Sade nodded, not out of gall, but truly he was overwhelmed. He felt as vulnerable as he did that first day at the apprentice market. Would this man and this family, as imperfect as they were, still accept them? Now everything rested on the edge of a knife. "Tell me, is it true?" Gerald asked. Sade had spent months at sea with this man who showed him the secrets of their craft. His brother had become a friend and protector to his daughters, and he had just shown them more loyalty than their own flesh and blood had. Sade knew he owed him at least a shred of the truth. "It's true," Sade said. "A slave owner attacked my brother, and in defending himself, Vondales killed him." Jillian began to weep, her face blanched. Gerald steadied himself on the railing of the stairwell. "That is the truth of it?" he asked. "Yes," Sade lied, for there had been other murders, and yet he could not explain those. A web of darkness rose in his chest and threatened to cut off his air. A gulf had suddenly formed between him and his master. Sade held himself still, listening for Gerald's next words. Finally he spoke. "You are our family as much as our friends. We will protect you." A weight lifted from Sade's shoulders. He could breathe again. He noticed Vondales' hand move away from the pommel of his sword. Jillian was still sobbing. Gerald took another sip from his flask and began to walk away. So be it. That day, Vondales was extra solicitous around the house, offering to help Jillian with everything from churning butter to fetching water from the well. But something was changed in her. She was a simple woman and an honest one, and already the lies to the king's men, the thought of a murderer in her house, chased the smile from her face and deepened the worry lines on her forehead and around her eyes. She had aged years in just a day. She barely spoke to Vondales, and she jumped whenever she turned and caught sight of him in the same room. As for the girls, she sent them to their grandmother's house to play for the day. A chill had also crept into the rapport between teacher and student. Gerald made every effort to be casual and jovial with Sade, as if nothing was wrong. But he took more sips from his flask than usual, and spent the morning looking over his shoulder. When Kingsmen appeared at the edge of the market crowd, instead of looking for more work, Gerald suggested they take bread and beer in a tavern together. Teacher and student sat in a dark corner among old sailors, fat drunks, and whores. Gerald emptied his flask into his mug and drank it as quickly as water. Sade sipped his. "Don't worry," Gerald said more to himself than Sade. "I'll figure something out." In retrospect, Sade knew he should have seen the betrayal coming, but hope had made him soft and trust had made him weak. So that night, he had gone to sleep as if all that Gerald had said was true, and as if they truly were family as much as friends. He woke just as the men were storming into the attic. They were too quick and too fierce for Sade and Vondales to react. They were not kingsmen. They did not announce themselves, "In the name of the king," or bother with other formalities. Rather, they worked in silence, wrapping Sade and his brother tightly in their blankets and gagging them with all the speed and deftness of men well practiced in kidnapping. Sade and Vondales fought as best as they could as the men carried them down the steps, out into the cold night. Jillian was weeping and Gerald pleading, "Please, don't hurt them." Sade's mind raced, trying to determine who their abductors were. Had Gerald made a deal with the guild? Were these people from Illicaine finally caught up with them for the murder of their uncle? As they were carried downhill toward the docks, Sade guessed rightly just who Gerald had contacted. Slavers. Gerald ran alongside them through the streets, his voice hoarse and his speech slurred. "I'm sorry, Slade. I'm sorry, so sorry, but I can't risk harboring you." He mumbled more apologies and excuses as they neared the docks. He wouldn't hand them over to Kingsmen. That would mean certain death. But murder was murder, and he could not have Sade and Vondales in his house, could not abide it, could not ask it of his wife, could not put his children in peril. "I couldn't bear to see you in the gallows," he prattled on. "But you said yourself you murdered a man. You don't deserve freedom. So I've made a moral compromise, you see." Gerald took another swig from his flask. "You shall do your time, and therefore justice will be served, but your lives will be spared." Gerald went on to say that his decision was generous. At least he tried to convince himself of it. Bound and gagged as he was, Sade could not respond. But if he could have, words would not have been sufficient. He wanted to smash in his teacher's skull. Their abductor set them down roughly over the thwarts of a rowboat. Sade listened as oars shot out over the sides and splashed into the water. He rolled to his side and took some comfort in feeling his brother up against him. "At least we are still together." As the ship cast off from the shore, he heard Gerald choke out some last words of farewell to them. "Perhaps a few years of hard labor will be good for you. It can build character. Safe journey." Chapter 19. The Jester and the Lady. Meshach shuffled down the corridor into a room that glowed with firelight. The smell of boiling vegetables, herbs, chopped meat, and grains wafted through the air. The kitchen where Meshach was preparing dinner appeared untouched by the curses that had so affected the rest of the castle. It looked lived in. Dirty dishes sat in a basin waiting to be cleaned. Rags hung over the fireplace drying, and a stew bubbled in a cauldron suspended over the fire. The stems of freshly cut tubers fanned out across the tabletop, and among them was a half-empty cup of tea beside a kettle. Meshach mumbled to himself something about finding a spoon as he searched around the floor of the table with trembling hands webbed with dry, cracked skin. He spat when he talked, and his eyes were narrow. His foot kicked and missed the spoon. He picked it up and, without washing it, stirred the pot of stew, then returned to the table to chop vegetables. Gabriella was still too stunned to do anything. She leaned against the wall and slid down to the floor. For a while, she simply stared at her own feet. But in her mind, she kept seeing Gayday, wrapped in swathes of light, and then abruptly erased, like a chalk drawing doused with water. Now her own friends were still trapped with that hideous girl. What will she do to Omanuju and Adamantus? Meshach was still chopping. Between chops, he took liberal sips of his tea. It was mixed with cream and left a brownish-white mustache on his lip. He would wipe the mustache away, leaving bits of vegetables in its place. He had not shaved for many days, and clearly had not bathed either. The hair that slipped out from beneath his jester's cap looked moist with grease. As the chopping progressed, his downstrokes became fiercer. Soon, instead of chops, he was hammering the knife down onto the cutting board, his eyes wild, spit and inarticulate curses shooting forth from his mouth. Gabriella sidled away from him, her hands jammed into her armpits, the hair raising on the back of her neck. She searched the room for exits. Deep lines ran down either side of Meshach's mouth and nose, and dark rings shaded the pasty skin below his eyes. She noticed that all the bells that hung on his costume were silent. Each had been smashed into flat discs. Although his costume was stained, and so threadbare that she could see Meshach's pale and pimply skin beneath, The mirrors that dangled on his chest and back were polished and immaculate. These were mirrors that belonged to a lady's vanity. They were set in gilded frames with purple lilies inlaid with colored glass. Gabriella knew that if they were to escape, she needed to learn more from this man. She might even have to make an ally of him. "Has Sybil ever killed a visitor to the island before?" she asked. Meshach looked up, startled. His nose crinkled as if he had just encountered an unpleasant smell or sensation. He snorted. "You are the first visitors to this rock. Most others have been warned that the island is cursed. No one comes here any longer. No ships even sail within sight. All the trade routes have broken down." "Then how do you have all this food?" Meshach raised his knife at Gabriella, then pointed it in the direction of the pantry. "Sybil, in her wisdom, meaning I told her, cast the same spell of suspension on all the foodstuffs, so we would not starve." "But why did she not freeze you? Was there anyone else she did not freeze?" Meshach stopped his cutting and stabbed the knife into the table so that it stuck there, quivering. "What are you saying? Are you accusing me of some sort of conspiracy with the girl? I hate her. I despise the little wench. I would kill her if she did not have that blasted wand. I will kill her one of these days, mark my words. She released me because she wanted entertainment. Plus, the little wretch can't cook for herself. She still wants to be waited on like royalty. Little bucket of puke." Despite the heat of the fire, the room felt as if it had grown colder. Meshach dropped the vegetables into the cauldron and slammed down the lid. He marched to the pantry to pull out a fresh bag of salt and threw it on the table, all the while barking at Gabriella. "You need to forget about that blue freak of a friend you had. He's dead and you will be too. If you don't learn to look out for yourself, you need to listen to me. Work with me. You can help me beat her. We can do away with her and take the wand." Gabriella's face flushed with heat to hear Gade described as a freak, but she sucked in her words of protest. Meshach was trying to get her to join in a conspiracy to kill a girl her age. If he were willing to kill Sybil, Gabriella knew it was not safe for her to cross him either. "You want to take the wand to lift the curse?" she asked, testing him. Meshach paused, as if she had said something he had not expected. Then he offered her a wide smile. "Of course, yes. We'll release all these poor people. But you need to learn a few things first, little... What is your name, by the way?" "Gabriella." "Gabriella? Beautiful name. You need to learn some things, and so do your companions out there. If anyone can talk sense into someone, Omonushu can. Perhaps he can get her to release the people in us." Meshach stopped, his chin resting on his fist. "It is best that he not try. He does not know her like I do. It's a waste of time. Also, you both need to know a few things in order to survive. First, never suggest that she looks older or that she is grown. As far as we are concerned, she looks the same as she did the day of her birthday when she got that wand. She is not outgrowing the dress. The dress is just shrinking, but she still looks radiant. Second, do not call her Highness or Majesty. Those are things you call grown-ups. Third, do anything she asks of you, or else you will pay dearly." He rolled up his sleeve to show scarred and twisted skin that had healed from burns. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I will have my revenge." Meshach opened the salt. "Meshach, why do you wear the mirrors?" Gabriella asked as she caught her own frightened reflection. Her hair remained tied up in an attempt to look her best for royalty. All their hopes felt like a cruel joke now. "You are a perceptive girl. It took Sybil some time to learn the wand, and she was often testing out his powers and spells on me. One day, when she was angry with me, she fired a blast but missed. The spell struck a shining candelabrum, and it shot in all directions. I put two and two together. The spells work like light. They reflect off shiny surfaces. I don't think she realizes this, but I wear these mirrors as protection. If she ever spells me again, it will reflect back and hit her." "Doesn't she wonder why you wear them?" "I tell her that it's in tribute to her unchanging beauty." "Can I get some for Omonushu and myself?" Meshach looked down his nose at her. "I will get them for you, if I'm convinced that you are truly on my side." Gabriella nodded slowly. She suspected she never would, but said nothing, letting her silence imply willingness. It seemed to be enough for Meshach. He went back into the pantry and returned with a crate of eggs. He removed the eggs from the straw that cradled them to reveal the crate's false bottom. From the hiding place, he produced a green vial of milky liquid. This is poison. A bit in her food each night will eventually do the job. Now, she always makes me taste her food first, but together we might be able to distract her and slip it in. Meshach stopped and put a hand on her shoulder. You look ill. Little one, I promise, this does not kill just by sight. Meshach laughed at his own joke. Gabriella did feel sick. Her limbs were trembling. I'm sorry. It has been a terrible day. Is there a privy around here somewhere? Come this way. Meshach led Gabriella through the doorway across the kitchen. They walked a short distance down a hallway to a row of small doors. Meshach opened one, revealing a small compartment with a bench with a wooden lid on it. Above the bench, a window let in a strong, fresh breeze. Meshach ushered her inside and closed the door. Then he locked it. This is just for safety's sake, to make sure you don't try anything foolish like running off. Just bang and call for me when you are finished. Gabriella had only time to get out the words, all right, before she felt the vomit rising in her throat. She lifted the lid and leaned over the hole. There was no bottom. It opened to the churning sea and rocks 100 feet below. The sudden vertigo melted her last resistance. She vomited. She had not eaten anything but biscuits most of the day in preparation for the feast that had been awaiting them. Now even they were wrenched away from her. Dropping into the sea, she retched again, this time only bile. Although her churning stomach was empty, her body still shook, and her throat heaved as if in protest of all the shame and evil around them. Her dry heaves finally dissolved into sobbing. Behind a locked door, with the sound of the surf filling the chamber, she cried without restraint. A few times she thought she heard Meshach creep up to the door to listen, but she did not care. She was curled in a tight ball on the floor, thinking of home and wishing she were there. It would not be so bad to return now. What did it matter if the Sevwar controlled the tower? She tried to imagine such a scenario, and at the moment it did not seem unlivable. Life would go on, she was sure. Anyway, she no longer had any choice. They could not pilot the Elan without Gade. She wondered if they would even get home. New tears came to her eyes. Would she die here? She pictured Meshach, his bitter eyes, his breath of rot, holding up the bottle of poison. As much as she hated Sybil, Gabriella had no desire to be her executioner. But what else could she do? The walls of the chamber seemed to be closing in around her. She dropped her head to her knees and felt something poke her in the chest. She pulled the sprig and leaves, still wrapped in the linen cloth, from her pocket. Even in the dim light of the privy chamber, the leaves glowed with jewel-like radiance, just like Gade's skin had. When she touched the leaves, calm washed over her. It was as if a bit of sunlight had broken through the clouds to shine directly on her. She felt her resolve return. Omanuju and Adamantis were still trapped with Sybil. Gabriella would have to do something to make sure she did not lose them as well. She stood up. Time was precious. She wanted to pace, but the best she could do was turn in a circle. It only made her dizzy. She sat beside the hole and stared down at the surf until she had a plan. She needed a mirror, but it would be too hard to get one while Meshach was watching her. She did not want to ask him for one. She knew he would hold that over her until he was confident of her loyalty. No telling how long that could take. Gabriella could not wait. She needed a mirror now. She listened to the door for Meshach, then tried the handle. Still locked. She had to explore other options. She stood on the bench and leaned out the window. The drop was 100 feet or so. Not into deep water, but white, violent surf foaming over sharp rocks. Normally, it would have been a drop that made her sick with vertigo, but she tried to tell herself it was a trifle compared to the height she was used to on the Elan. Above, the castle walls rose in a tapered fashion. The privy itself stuck out from the wall so that there was a small ledge she could stand on, and a few feet above that was a window on the next floor. It would not be in reach even if she were standing on the privy roof. She would still have to climb. The gaps in the rocks of the castle were large, maybe large enough for her fingers and toes. The shadow moved under the privy door. Gabriella made a coughing sound again. The effort alone made some of her nausea return. The shadow moved away, and Meshach's footsteps receded. She slipped off her shoes and placed them as they would be if she were sitting on the bench. Just in case Meshach looked under the door, she yanked the twine from her hair and tossed most of it down the privy hole, along with her hopes of a royal dinner. Escape was her focus now. She pulled her hair into a single ponytail with the rest of the twine, then stepped into the window. The stone of the sill was cold under her bare feet. She was uncomfortable leaning out of the window, her center of gravity dangerously extended over the water. With her legs braced against the window's sides, she stretched up to grab the roof of the privy. Loose flakes of mortar shifted under her fingers. She had not counted on that. The dust blew into her eyes. Once she had cleared it away with a few sweeps of her hand, she tested her grip, then swung her legs out and upwards. It was not graceful. By the time she had clawed her way to the top of the privy roof, she had stinging cuts all over her legs and arms. The window on the next floor looked even farther now that she was outside the safety of the privy. The roof was such a narrow ledge, she doubted that she could keep purchase on it if she fell down from above. Just don't fall, she told herself, sending a prayer to Gayday to watch over her. She was on the east side of the castle, so the island cast a long somber shadow on the waters below as the sun set. A pink moon, waxing to full, was rising early in the east. How could so much time have passed? She wondered. They had little more than 2 weeks left to complete their journey to find Nicromedes' treasure and return it in order to pay for the Tower lands. And they had not even reached the eastern continent yet. She realized with Gayday gone, the trip was a failure. If they escaped, they had to turn back. If they escaped. Gabriella turned her attention back to the rock wall inches from her face. Lichens grew profusely along the stones, adding to the island's sense of decay. At least the gaps between the stones were larger up close, but her hands and feet were smooth and slippery from her sweat. She rubbed her palms and her feet in the mortar dust and began to climb. Her feet held. She knew she did not have strong arms and she would have to rely on her feet to push her upwards. She told herself it would be just like climbing a ladder. She made it up one level of stones, and the second tier was not difficult. Although she could find excellent handholds for the third, she could not find space enough for her toes. Her arms were growing tired of the burden already. She searched the wall for better holds. To her left, the mortar had washed completely away from around the stone. It would provide perfect footing, allowing her to reach the windowsill above. But the stone was over the water, beyond the safety of the privy roof. The wall to the right did not provide any better roots. She shifted her weight and slid her foot into the crack on the left. At least it was wide and deep. She could wedge half her left foot in. She secured her fingers around the next stone. The corner of the sill was just inches away. She positioned her right foot just above the left in order to push off. There was an ominous shifting beneath her. The stones clicked against one another with a deep tapping noise. Her first instinct was to grab hold tighter and deeper, but she was already holding as tightly as she could, and the stones would not give any more leverage. The stone without the mortar around it had shifted when she had placed her right foot atop it, tapping the brick beneath. Now her left foot was pinched under. Her heart was pounding so hard in her chest, she was sure it would knock her off balance. She pictured herself falling backwards, her foot bones breaking as she came loose. Her body crumpled on the rocks in a bloody surf. The breakers roared beneath her. She took a deep breath and retraced her motions. The stone had moved when she had put her right foot upon it. She lifted her right foot. The pressure on her left foot went away. She would have to anchor her left foot somewhere else. She slipped it into a vertical crack between two stones. She could not push off this way, but she could compensate. The position put additional strain on her arms, but that was simply the cost she would have to pay. She returned her right foot to the movable stone, secured a hold, then slowly pressed downward. Her legs straightened. Her hands reached the sill. She was not safe yet. Her arms were trembling. She knew at best she could hang on, but she lacked the strength to pull herself up. She regretted not eating more that day. She felt weak and lethargic. Her father would have reminded her to breathe deep in such moments of tension. She did. With more certainty, she moved her left leg upwards slowly, like a cat stalking prey. She found a hold, tested it, then pushed. Her elbows crossed over the sill. Now she kicked wildly at the wall, heaving herself forward through the window and tumbling onto the floor. She sprawled out on the floor, gasping. Soaked with perspiration, her body left a wet print on the floor when she finally found the strength to stand. "Thank you, Gayday," she thought. She looked around, but no mirrors. She appeared to be in a reading room, and she needed to find bedchambers. She approached the door, pulled down the handle, and pushed it. The door shuddered as it groaned open on its hinges. The hallway was empty of frozen residents of the castle. She dashed from one door to the next, but they only led to more public rooms that were useless to her. Bedchambers must be on another floor, she surmised. Gabriella ran until she found a stairwell, pausing briefly to note the way she had come. She started up, stopping at the next landing, and looked down the hall. It was like the one before. Her instincts told her to keep going. The following floor was the same, but the fourth level held promise. A red carpet covered the stone floor. Vases stood in alcoves, and rich tapestries drooped with their loads of dust and cobwebs. Gabriella darted from the stairwell, turned the corner, and almost shrieked. It was clear that not everyone in the castle had been taken unawares. Here was a scene of resistance. Soldiers, frozen in various poses of attack, crowded the hallway. Their intact bodies contrasted with the decaying remains of men Sybil had not shown as much mercy. She had killed many and left them to rot. Desiccated limbs stretched forth from charred armor, the skull's jaws gaping open. Broken bones protruded through skin that was dry and papery. Gabriella flung herself forward without looking down. She turned into the first room. A lavish couch and cedar armoire told her this was what she was looking for, a private chamber. She dashed into the next room and was startled again. Two figures had been caught by Sybil's wand, a beautiful woman with flowing raven hair and her lady-in-waiting. Gabriella realized that someone had been there since the fateful birthday. Many times, for there were dried and fresh flowers placed in a ring about the noble woman. The stones at her feet were stained with puddles of wax where fat candles had burned themselves out. There was a place on the edge of the bed where the mattress was still depressed, not from someone sleeping, but from someone sitting up on the edge of the bed gazing at this woman. Who was she? Gabriella wondered. She ran to the vanity, a dressing table where the woman must have once sat to do her hair. Markings in the dust revealed that 2 mirrors had been removed. And then Gabriella made her discovery. A small hand mirror. She snatched it up, turned it over, and saw little purple lilies etched into the frame. She pumped her fist. Something finally had gone right, but she could not linger. The flowers, the candles, the depression on the mattress were reminders of Meshach's presence, his obsession with this woman and her beauty. She stuffed the mirror into her pocket and ran back down the stairs, past the scene of the battle and the empty chambers, back to the window over the privy. Halfway there, she realized it would be easier to climb down if she had a rope. She turned to the hallway with the soldiers, but none of them had one. Time was running out. She knew she had been gone too long. Her mind was racing as she rushed into another room. It was a bedroom. She ripped the blankets from the bed, stripped the sheets, then used her knife to cut them into thirds. She was grateful for Gade's instructions about knots as she tied sheets end to end and sent him another prayer of thanks. The wind gusted, ruffling the canopy over the bed and opening a closet door. Gabriella jumped, dropped her knife. Gabriella did not want to see what she thought she had seen, but she could not keep herself from crossing the room, putting her hand on the closet door and opening it further. She knelt down beside 2 children. A girl, maybe a few years younger than Gabriella herself, was curled protectively around her brother, a toddler. The girl's face was obscured by her hair. Her hand was over her brother's eyes. His mouth was bent in terrified expression. The girl's other hand was up as if to reach for the closet door. Gabriella wiped her nose and sniffled. She was surprised how this affected her. For the first time, she reached to touch one of the frozen people, clasping the girl's outstretched hand as if somehow she could offer her comfort. It was cold. With painful clarity, Gabriella knew now how much she missed her family. She looked at the boy. An abyss opened within her, and she fell backwards as if she had been kicked. The knowledge of the pain she would feel if anything ever happened to her brother washing over her. Her feeling was not love, but born of the darkness of love's underside. Fear. Fear for herself, the guilt, the self-accusation she would experience if something terrible ever happened to Dameon, because she had wished it so many times. Gabriella stepped backwards away from the window, gathered the sheets and her knife, feeling the urgency of the moment return, raced out of the room. She carried the bundle of sheets back to the window and tied the end around a column. Just before she dropped the rest of the length over the side, She speculated that it would be safer just to go back to the kitchen and not climb back into the privy. She played out a scenario where she would tell Meshach that she had been knocking at the door, calling for him. But since he had not heard her, she had tried an alternative route, climbing up the wall to the window. He would never believe her. Even if he did, he would surely doubt her. Climbing out and risking her life only showed how desperate she was and how little she trusted him. She dropped back over the side. The sun had sunk farther into the sea, and the shadow of the castle had grown longer and darker. The moon was a pale white now. The wind was cold as she shimmied, the sheets clutched between her arms and legs. She moved down to the roof and let her rump rest on it for a moment. Then she heard the pounding on the door below, and Meshach asking, "Are you all right in there?" She slipped off the side so quickly she nearly slid down the length of the sheets and dropped off the end. Her leg hooked over the sill, and she pulled herself in. She landed on the bench with a thud. Meshach heard it. "Gabriella, answer me or I'm coming in." The key slipped into the lock. "I'm fine," she said, but the key was jiggling into the tumblers. Something touched her shoulder. The sheet was blowing in through the window. She stood up on the bench and drew her knife to cut it. The key turned. The bolt slid out of place. He would hear the fabric ripping. The door handle moved downward. Gabriella leaned out the window, pulled the sheet to the side, and drove her knife through it into a crevice between the stones. The door opened. The lid over the hole thudded like a drum as Gabriella dropped onto it. She leapt into her shoes and adjusted her dress. Meshach's face peered around the edge of the door. Gabriella feigned embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I've got the runs too. I've been drinking bad water, but I think they've passed." Meshach grimaced and left grumbling. Chapter 20. A Fallen House. The stew was ready. Meshach had warmed a few rolls over the fire and set out a dish of butter. A kettle steamed with fresh tea, a sweating pitcher held chilled milk, and sliced meats were fanned out over a porcelain dish. Gabriella's stomach rumbled at the sight of so much food. When Meshach turned his back, she brushed mortar dust off her skirt. The crate of eggs was gone, along with the vial of poison. Meshach pointed to a clock on the wall. For a moment, Gabriella marveled at its size. The clock in her village was enormous and rarely worked. Most people just used the sundial. This small marvel ticked away, its pendulum waving happily. It was 5 minutes to 6. Meshach rumbled that Sybil expected her dinner on the hour. For her plan to work, Gabriella knew she needed to be the one to carry the food to Sybil. She had to guarantee that Meshach would ask her to. Meshach mumbled something about her taking too long in the privy, and now it was his turn to drain the hole. "Watch the bread," he told Gabriella as he stepped through the doorway. "Don't let it burn." When Gabriella heard the door close behind him, she scanned the kitchen for ideas. She considered finding the key to the privy and locking Meshach inside. But then she noticed that the wood rack beside the fireplace was empty. The fire was already burning low. She tipped the cauldron so that some of the stew fell onto the logs beneath. The logs hissed angrily. More rolls were toasting in a rack over the flames. Undaunted by the fact that they were too hot to eat, she stuffed one into her mouth and washed it down with a ladle of water. A poker hung beside the hearth. She used it to rearrange the logs to hide the vegetables that had spilled with the broth. When Meshach returned, she made a show of blowing on the fire. "It's gotten quite low," she said. Meshach looked from the empty wood rack to the clock. He cursed. "You don't know where the wood is kept. Can you carry a tray?" "I used to serve in a fine lady's house," Gabriella lied. "Good. Just serve Sybil. Ask her if she needs anything. Get her anything she wants. Then wait in the doorway while she takes the first few bites. If she does not like something, she will ring the bell on the tray." "How far away is the wood? How long will you be gone?" "Why?" he said, turning a suspicious eye on Gabriella. "Are you afraid you can't do this?" No. I was just wondering in case I had a question." "Carry the tray, serve the food, wait in the doorway. You can handle that. Sometimes she might ask you to sample it, to make sure it is not poisoned, but she does this at random times. Likely she will not. The wood is outside the keep. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Look at the clock, it is time." He set all the items on the tray, then handed it to Gabriella. "Don't drop it, hurry up." He picked up the wood carrier beside the hearth and swept out through the doorway, still mumbling. The dishes shook on the tray as Gabriella carried it down the hallway. She stopped just before entering the throne room to place the mirror's handle upwards in her pocket. Omanuju was still talking, his voice droning beyond the tapestries covering the opening into the huge room. Gabriella listened. His voice was echoing in the empty chamber. Omanuju was telling the story of Zomar, the sailor, and his 7 sisters. It was a story about how, as a young lad, Zomar had taken his family for granted and treated his sisters horribly. But after 7 ill fortunes befell Zomar, each of his sisters pitched in to help him 7 times. There was a purpose behind choosing such a story. Gabriella knew Omanuju was already working on themes to reconcile Sybil with her own family. Gabriella steeled herself in preparation for her plan. Then, picking up the serving tray, pushing aside the dust-laden tapestries to enter. "Put it here, slave, on this table," Sybil said as Gabriella appeared. Standing close to Omanuju to feel more secure, Gabriella was careful not to look at him, lest she appear suspicious. Adamantus stood nearby, a saddle thrown over his back. Gabriella's plan hinged on goading Sybil to overreacting to a clumsy slave. She did not know how much patience the princess had, not much judging so far. But Gabriella knew she had to push her. She stopped at the bottom of the steps to the throne. When Sybil saw that Gabriella had paused with her dinner, the princess raised her hand and told Omanuju to stop. She spat out a strand of hair she had been chewing. "Why are you standing there like you are dumb?" "I was awaiting permission to approach, Your Highness." Sybil's face hardened. "You may not call me Highness." "I am so sorry. I meant Your Majesty," Gabriella interrupted. Sybil, clutching the wand, stood up in the seat of the throne. "You will not call me Majesty. You will not interrupt me. You— 1,000 apologies, O wise one. I am not wise. Wise is for the old. 1,000,000 apologies. Let me bring you your dinner." Gabriella began running up the steps. When she was close, Gabriella tripped and threw the tray down in front of her, spilling the food and tea across the front of Sybil's dress. The sound of Sybil's gasp echoed in the silence that followed. Adamantus's hooves clicked on the floor as he stepped backwards. Omanuju's arm was raised as if to help, but Gabriella had carefully placed herself too far away for him to intervene. Sybil's lips were trembling. The wand shook in her fist. Gabriella fought her tension and feigned a wide yawn, only covering her mouth at the last moment, as if just remembering Sybil's presence. She put her hands over her heart as if in a frank apology. It was also where the pocket with the mirror was. "I'm sorry, Princess. I'm just so tired. I wish I could just sleep. Maybe you could spell me into a nap. I promise I could be better." Sybil's expression did not change. "I would torture you, but I need you to clean up this mess. But I still wish to torture you for your impudence." "I know," she said. "I shall make 2 of you. 1 to clean, 1 to torture. You can take turns each day." Things were spinning wildly out of control. "Oh, please no, my beautiful princess. I'm sure I only need a nap." It was too late. Sybil lifted her wand and squinted. Light burst forth. Gabriella whipped the mirror out in front of her. Her own terrified reflection looked back at her. She twisted her wrist and snapped the mirror around. There was a pop as the reflecting surface bounced the spell away. Gabriella lost her footing and fell backwards. Sybil's pupils shrank into pinpoints as light, bright as the sun, enveloped her. Energy sizzled in the air. The princess opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her body doubled over in pain, and she clutched her middle as if she had been impaled by a spear. Gabriella scrambled down the steps to Omanuju's side. "What have I done? Can we help her?" Omanuju stepped forward up the stairs, but the heat radiating from the light was too much. "There is nothing we can do now," he said. The light became a wedge and pierced Sybil in the navel. She tumbled over to the floor. Her right arm still clutched the wand. Gabriella knew she should try to take it, but she was afraid of approaching the princess and the burning light. Sybil waved her arms wildly. Gabriella could not believe her eyes. There were 3 arms, then 4. 2 extra had sprouted from Sybil's armpits. In the new left hand there was a second wand. "Help me!" Sybil cried, but her voice was actually 2 voices speaking in unison. Now there were 2 extra legs and soon a second torso, twisting like a wrestler away from an opponent. With a horrible stretching sound, a second head began to bud from the side of Sybil's skull. A double face appeared, then divided. Gabriella could see two distinct heads before a final flash of light. When it faded, there were two Sibyls sitting on the dais. They wore identical ill-fitting dresses. The original Sibyl on the right was unconscious, but the second Sibyl, on the left, leaned against the queen's throne and rubbed her head. She seemed surprised to find a light blue wand in her left hand. "I think I have just made things terribly worse," Gabriella said. "Where am I?" the second Sibyl asked. "Who are you?" The first Sibyl groaned. "Listen, you can come with us," Gabriella said. "This is a cursed place." The second Sibyl struggled to concentrate, rubbing her eyes. "Wait, I know you. You are my slave, my lazy slave." She looked again at her wand. "This is mine, isn't it?" "Time for us to go," Omanuju said, picking up Gabriella and tossing her onto the back of Adamantus. He mounted behind her, and the elk made a break for the door, his hooves throwing off chips of stone from where they struck the flagstone floor. "Come back here!" the second Sibyl shrieked. In the courtyard, they skidded to a stop before a surprised Meshach. "What's going on?" He dropped his bundle of wood, the logs tumbling out onto the ground. "The Sibyl has become the victim of her own spell," Omanuju said. By means of explanation, Gabriella held out the mirror. "I tried goading her into firing at me. I was hoping to deflect a spell of sleep at her, but it was something else." "Where is she now? What happened to her?" "She is unconscious, but the wand." "Forget the wand, Meshach. You can escape with us. This is your only chance," Gabriella said. But he was already running into the castle screaming, his voice echoing off the castle walls. "You little wench! Now you will bend a knee to me!" She felt the elk shudder beneath them. Omanuju sighed. "The corruption in this place is irredeemable. Let the lost seek the lost." They galloped past the blue oak, Gabriella fighting back tears that they were leaving with one less in their party than they had arrived with. The elk turned down a corridor, leapt around a colonnade, and descended through the garden. The growth was thick and disoriented her. She lost her sense of direction. When they emerged on the far side of the garden, she saw the Elan's prow directly ahead of them. Funny, that didn't seem to be where they left the ship. "That is odd," she said, more to herself than Omanuju. "I could have sworn we moored farther down." Adamantus seemed confused as well, and slowed his stride. His nose studied the scents on the wind. Perhaps the ship simply had drifted, Gabriella thought. They were lucky it had not floated farther. The airship disappeared from sight as they passed under one last set of trees before the elk came to an abrupt halt. Adamantus lowered his head to get a better look at the scene unfolding before them. Gabriella, looking between his antlers, could not believe what she saw. Dameon was climbing up the hill towards them. It had to be another boy, she thought. The sun was playing tricks on her. This cursed castle was playing tricks on her. The boy in front of her only looked like Dameon. He called out her name, his face unmistakable, the voice undeniably his. She had been put asleep, she realized. This was a dream. This was a nightmare. Sibyl's punishment. "Gabriella!" He called out again and ran forward to her. He tripped and fell as a leash fastened to his feet ran out of slack. "Dameon?" she cried, dismounting to run to his side. She picked him up. His face was gaunt. His lips were cracked as if he had not had water for days, and he reeked of urine and feces. Once in her arms, he began to keen and rock. It was her brother. He was real. Dameon could only take short steps due to the leash. Gabriella followed its length to a figure standing among the trees. In one hand, he held the line leading to Dameon. In the other, a crossbow, the bolt loaded and the string taut. Mortimer Creedley, the hunter-trapper from Harkness that had pulled Dameon out of the stream what felt like a lifetime ago, looked as shocked to see Omanuju and Gabriella as they were to discover him. "Mortimer," Omanuju said. "Omanuju, Aunt, what are you doing here?" Mortimer's question remained unanswered as a ground-shaking explosion erupted from the castle. Gabriella spun around, her ponytail snapping in the air beside her head, to see a section of the castle wall launch skyward. Bricks hurled into the air, flying towards them like swallows in migration. The entire battlement teetered, leaned, then began to tumble across the garden. "Run!" Omanuju cried. Gabriella grabbed her brother and darted to her right, just as a piece of castle rolled end over end through the trees. It careened through the garden, breaking branches, flattening bushes, and leaving deep gouges in the ground until it rolled to a stop, settling like a small house fallen from the sky. Smaller pebbles hailed down around them with a noisy rattle, snapping against leaves. The petals were followed by a snow of dust settling over the plants. Gabriella blinked a grit out of her eye as a second clap of thunder sounded, followed by a long, sustained flash. Rays of light shot out from within the main keep, shaving off more of the castle's rocks and mortar, creating a second barrage of wild stones and collapsing battlements. Gabriella curled around her brother. This avalanche, even larger than the first, flew over their heads and landed farther down the garden as great sections of wall toppled and crashed down the slope, crushing statues and sweeping aside trees like angry giants. Gabriella looked up from her brother and saw Mortimer staring down at his crossbow. The bolt had sprung. Omanuju lay on his side, writhing and groaning in pain. When he rolled onto his back, she saw the dart lodge between his ribs. "Omanuju!" she cried, while Mortimer looked horror-struck at the empty crossbow. He threw it aside and rushed to Omanuju's side. Even Adamantus bent down, his eyes deep pools of anxiety. Omanuju grimaced, lifting his hand from the wound and turning up his palm, now covered in bright red blood. "Omanuju, I am so sorry, I did not mean," Mortimer said. "An accident, Mortimer, I know, but we must get to the Elan." Omanuju drew himself up, wincing and gasping from the pain of movement. Gabriella and Mortimer pushed him to lay back. Their eyes met. Gabriella saw terrible, sincere shame on Mortimer's face, but it barely registered with her, her anger growing to fury. As if reading her mind, Omanuju croaked, "No time for recriminations. We must escape." Adamantus trotted up, sliding in among them so they could help Omanuju onto his back. He clung to Adamantus's neck, then reached down to help Gabriella climb up behind him, his movements leaving a bright red streak of blood on the elk's fur. "No, go! I need to get Dameon!" She slapped the elk's flank and turned to her brother. He rocked and moaned, covering his ears and squeezing his eyes shut. He had not been in such a state since they had tried to make him spend a day in the schoolhouse learning with the other children. But this was much worse. Before Gabriella could pick up Dameon, Mortimer swept him up and tucked her brother under his arm like a bag of feed. He ducked under a flying brick and motioned for Gabriella to run. They followed Adamantus as he led them through the trees to the pier as bricks continued to shatter around them. At the garden's edge, where the Elan was moored, a smaller ship drifted beside it with the name Tantalon etched onto its side. Gabriella scanned the deck hopefully for passengers, other Harkonites, or even some second incarnation of Gade. But the decks of both ships were empty. Mortimer and her brother must have come alone. A smoking piece of roof from the castle plowed into the deck of the Tantalon like a meteor. It exploded through the planking and shot out the bottom of the hull. The ship swung violently to starboard, its mooring line snapping it back with equal force just before the ship knocked into the larger hull of the Elan. The crippled Tantalon still floated, but Adamantus led them to the Elan. Mortimer, Dameon in his arms, raced up the gangway. Gabriella realized she was the only one who could untie the ship's mooring ropes. She sprinted to the first stone plinth and yanked the knots apart. As she bent over the ropes, the back of her neck tingled with more flashes of heat from the castle. Sybil's temper was a terrible one. Gabriella untied the second line and let the rope zip off the side of the cliff. The wood of the hull was smooth under her palms, and she knew a constant, steady push could send the large vessel moving. A ship floating on air was even more responsive than one in water, and the Elan shifted quickly from her efforts. She ran to the gangplank as it slid across the grass towards the cliff's edge. She was halfway up it when it cleared the cliff and suddenly snapped downward, making Gabriella lose her footing. But Mortimer was there to catch her by the sleeve. Gabriella felt herself slipping out of her clothes, but he leaned dangerously over the edge of the top of the gangway and wrapped her wrist in his other hand. Dameon was screaming her name. Gabriella stopped sliding, but Mortimer held overcommitted, holding himself in place with only a single boot hooked around a railing. Adamantus took the waistband of Mortimer's trousers in his teeth and pulled them both onto the deck, like a faithful dog pulling his master from a river. "Smart animal." Mortimer nodded at the elk as he lay on his back, his chest rising and falling. Gabriella lay panting, but she had only seconds to catch her breath. "The sails!" she cried, racing to mid-deck. While she unfurled the main shrouds and the panels, Mortimer carried Omanuju below. Gabriella warning him to avoid the weak section of the port deck. The Elan was more than a stone's throw from the cliff's edge now. Away from the shelter of the island, the wind gusted. Gabriella cranked the wheel, heaved a lever down the way she had seen Gede do, and banked the Elan into the wide turn. The ship listed, its sails sweeping close to the rocky cliffs. Dishes tumbled from the cupboards and crashed in the galley. With a strong wind, the sailcloth bellied outward, bloody in the light of the setting sun. She flew the ship east, with the sole thought of escaping from the reach of Sybil's wand, but knowing full well they eventually would have to turn back west. The voyage was over. Their hopes of reaching Dis, retrieving the treasure, and saving the Tower of the Dead lay in ruin. They would have to go home, if it was even possible to survive the return trip, empty-handed and defeated.